with Micki Shelton, author of La Posada, a new play, which will be premiering at the Elks Opera House in Prescott on October 6th and running for three performances. So can you just give us a gloss of what is the subject, the purpose, the focus of La Posada?
Well, La Posada is ostensibly about the rebuilding of Mary Jane Coulter's masterpiece, which opened just before the stock market crash. 1930, and it closed in 1957, a year before Mary Jane Coulter died. But it became offices for the Santa Fe Railway. That's why it wasn't torn down, but it was in disrepair. And, you know, the gardens were dead, everything like that. And it was listed on the National Historic Preservation of Buildings list as one of the most endangered buildings in the country. Alan Affeldt, who was working on his dissertation in California and had sort of a hobby of looking into old buildings, came over to see it, found that nobody in Winslow had the money to save it, although they really wanted to save it. And he had a history of raising money, and so he decided to get involved and possibly renovate the building, along with his wife and Dan Lutzig, a friend of his who is a sculptor.
So this play is, on the surface, it's about the restoration of the La Posada Hotel in Winslow.
Correct. But there's a deeper level, and that's really about the three people and others who helped renovating it. So we go into their stories and who they are and why they would do such a thing. But it's more than that. It's about their desire to make the world a better place, to use their own abilities, whatever those are. Tina's is painting. Tina Mion is a painter. And Dan Lutzig, a sculptor, and Alan Affeldt is really someone who can see the big picture and run the gamut of politicians and funders and do all the paperwork that's necessary to renovate a building. And in fact, after he renovated La Posada, he has now gone on to renovating other important Fred Harvey buildings and other buildings. And in this case, in New Mexico.
Many of the people who I presume are going to come see this play are going to remember your previous premiere here in Prescott in 2012.
Correct.
Fred and Mary, An Unconventional Romance. Can you tell me about parallels between Fred and Mary and the play La Posada?
Right. Would you like to know a little bit about how I got the idea for writing Fred and Mary?
Sure, if it connects to,
It does. It was about 1996 when I hiked the Grand Canyon from the South Rim to the North Rim. And while there, I found out about this female architect who was creating buildings, designing buildings in the early 1900s. In fact, her first building for the Fred Harvey Company was in 1901. Her first full building was Hopi House, which is there at the Grand Canyon in the South Rim. So I was fascinated by that story and decided to write a play about it. I had written about 10 other full-length plays and some short plays. And then one day, while I was listening to the radio, I heard that an Alan Affeldt was renovating a Mary Jane Coulter building in Winslow. That name sounded very familiar to me, and there aren't too many Alan Affeldts. So I called Alan. I had worked with him in the peace movement in Los Angeles in the 1980s. I said, I'm writing a play about Mary Jane Coulter. I'd like to do our first public reading at La Posada. And he said, well, you better write it first. So I wrote it. We did a reading at La Posada in 2010. And then in 2012, the play Fred and Mary was a part of the Arizona Centennial. So while I was doing the research at La Posada and at the Grand Canyon, I saw this big, huge, beautiful painting on the wall, and it was of Soviet babushkas and American nuns. And I wondered about that. So I asked questions about it and found that Tina Mion and Ellen Affeldt had met on the Soviet-American Peace March. And although La Posada was Mary Jane Coulter's favorite building, I decided, yeah, there's a whole story here at La Posada about the peace movement and using your skills to, in whatever way, make the world a better place. In this case, renovate a beautiful historic building. And so in that play, Fred and Mary, I hardly mention La Posada. It's just in passing because I was saving it for this new play. And people might be interested that Fred and Mary do make an appearance in this play.
Oh, they do?
They want to see how things turn out with the renovation of their beautiful building.
So would you say that there's an element of fantasy to the play, or do you call
Yes.
it magical realism, or do you know?
Yeah, it isn't quite magical realism, but most of my plays do end up with some phantasmagoric, whatever that word is, phantasmagoric elements. They seem to come out. And in fact, while the previous play is called Fred and Mary, an Unconventional Romance, it's highly unlikely that Fred and Mary ever really met. But in my mind, they live at the Lookout Studio together at the Grand Canyon, and so they're together. And of course, the romance is my own fantasy.
Sure.
But it all fits together because Mary Jane Coulter wrote a fantasy or a false history for every one of her buildings. So if she could do that, then I can create my own fantasy about her and Fred Harvey, and that's what I've done.
When audiences come to see La Posada, what can they expect to be talking about or thinking about as they leave the theater?
Well, as I say, it's not just about the renovation of the building. I finally decided to start writing this play that I knew I would write, but I hadn't yet gotten to it. I started writing it in 2018, and things were getting weird between the Soviet Union, well, now Russia, and us. And when Russia eventually invaded Ukraine, and I was still working on the first, about the 7th full draft, I thought, wow, this play is really relevant right now, because in one of the early scenes of the play, it's a flashback, John F. Kennedy is signing the Limited Test Ban Treaty. There are mentions of the struggle between, at that time, the Soviet Union and the U.S. And now here we are again with Russia invading Ukraine. And I saw, well, this becomes a very, very relevant play. We're back sort of where we were then, and possibly even more dangerous.